Welcome everyone to the next Catributors podcast, and we have our reoccurring guest Drac. Do you want to introduce yourself again?
Hello, well, yep, it's me, Drachinifel, of the YouTube naval history channel of the same name. So we're here to see what has crept in as a new line, and what kind of tangential relationship to historical events these actually has.
Yes, this is one of the more interesting lines in terms of actual historiosity. We've also got a couple other ships to discuss besides that, but
Yep.
I think we'll start off with the Japanese because that's what you've prepared for the most.
Yes. Yeah, and that was fun because as we were just saying before we started streaming, if you're going to talk about anything to do with hypothetical Japanese cruisers, you basically end up having to go to Japanese Cruisers of the Pacific War, which is a relatively hard to find book, but when you find it, you sometimes wish you hadn't, because the blasted thing is it's literally the size and thickness of a phone book. It has all the information, well, most of the information you could possibly ever want, but it does mean you're literally lugging around half of a dead tree.
Yeah.
Is it at least in English?
I'm kind of surprised, given how much Japan sort of trashed their own records at the end of the war. I'm kind of surprised there's even that much sort of information remaining. But I suppose a lot of smart people have done a lot of detective work over the years.
Yes, yeah. I mean, some stuff survived, some stuff was known, obviously because it covers Japanese, including the pre-war stuff. So some stuff was already known pre-war, and a lot of it was reconstructed from either examination of what was left and technical documents, etc. So it shows how much you can piece together, but also, how much was lost. Because there are sections, even in this book, where they're just sort of like, well, this is as much as we know, or it could have been this, or possibly this, but final determination is unknown and probably forever will be.
So, I guess we'll jump right in then. So, starting at Tier 5, we have Agano, which notably we already have in the game in the form of the premium Tier 5 Yahagi.
Yes. Yeah, so this is an interesting one, actually, in that by the time we get even to Tier 5 in the cruiser line, the Japanese have essentially abandoned the idea of the light cruiser the way that everyone else would see it. So you've got, well, what's the Crown Colonies, what's in game as the Fijis, and you've got the Clevelands, obviously. And in both of those cases, you have Britain and America continuing down the light cruiser development line. The Japanese divide their cruisers slightly differently. They don't call them heavy and light. They call them Class A, Class B, and Class C. A Class A is what we would call a heavy cruiser. Class B is what we would call a light cruiser, or more accurately, in Japanese terms, a cruiser armed with 6-inch guns. And then Class C is kind of specialist cruisers that start to depart from a primarily gun and torpedo-based armament. And so the Megamis, for example, in their 666-inch form are Class B, but then once they receive their twin 8s, they are now Class A cruisers. So Agano is classified as a Class B cruiser because she and her sisters are armed with 6-inch guns. They're armed with, they're equipped, as their primary offensive armament is guns and torpedoes. Although this is why I say they've kind of abandoned the traditional idea of the light cruiser, in that these ships are, with the Megamis, is basically the last time you see a traditional Class B cruiser design. This design is obviously a lot smaller. It's designed as a destroyer flotilla leader. It's not designed to act as an independent cruiser the way that, as I said earlier, the Towns, Crown Colonies, or Clevelands would be.
So when they have a special cruiser class like Class C, would they put something like dedicated anti-air cruiser in there? Did they actually have dedicated anti-air cruisers?
They had a few designs for anti-aircraft cruisers, which were classified as Class C, but those were part of the Circle 5 and Circle 6 fleet replenishment programs that never really got off the ground because of the war. And Oyodo, which is notable in this tree by its absence, was also a Class C cruiser, because although it did have 6-inch guns, it obviously only had the 6-inch guns forward and aft, was designed with aircraft handling facilities because it was designed as a submarine squadron flagship. And this is notable because obviously Agano and Oyodo are the two last 6-inch classes the Japanese actually build, and they're both designed as flagships for squadrons of other vessel types.
So was there a reason why they abandoned like the idea of building light cruisers?
Basically, it all revolved around their concept of how they were going to use their fleet. So the whole idea that had built up pre-war of the Japanese fleet was this idea of massive torpedo attacks on an enemy battle line at night. And in order to do that, that's why you see the Japanese destroyers have increasingly heavy torpedo armament and torpedo reloads, the ultimate expression of that being the Shimakaze. But they realize that if you're going to try and break a fleet's screen at night to get in and sink what they think is going to be the battleships, that enemy fleet screen, most likely American, is going to include cruisers as well. And the Japanese view the best way of sinking cruisers as to use the 8-inch gun because it does more damage per hit. And if you're going to be fighting at night with their night fighting techniques, they're anticipating surprise attacks. So they want to deliver the maximum possible alpha strike with their guns rather than, a hail of 6-inch fire, which may or may not put a ship down. And if it does, it might take a bit longer and therefore give that ship a chance to signal or get shots in reply or whatever. Plus, they also have a slightly more tangential view that 8-inch guns might, at closer ranges, be sufficient to do some damage to enemy capital ships, whereas they don't think the 6 inches will at all. Ironically enough, they're kind of proven right, except they're proven right by the Americans in the night actions off Guadalcanal with Hiei and Kirishima, particularly Hiei, obviously, in the first night action. But this is why they want the 8-inch cruisers, and Megami is designed to be swapped over to these 8-inch because they, under the treaty limits, obviously by the time you get to the 1930s, not only has the treaty split cruisers between 8-inch and 6-inch cruisers, but it's also got a hard cap on the number of 8-inch cruisers. So if the Japanese had their way, they wouldn't have built the Megamis with 666s in the first place. They would have just kept building more 8-inch ships. But they had to at least appear to be abiding by the treaties. So having reached their limit of 8-inch, they were now going and saying, "Oh well, no, these are our 6-inch ships." Honestly, quietly building a bunch of twin 8s to stick on them.
It is interesting to note that there's quite a gap in terms of light cruiser building as well, because they were going in. Even in the Second World War, they were using a bunch of basically 20s light cruisers, and then there's sort of quite a big gap. And then I think in the late 30s, the Aganos get designed, and then they don't actually enter the water until I think 1941.
Yeah, and it's also recognition of Japan's limited technological resources. They don't have as many shipyards, they don't have as many slipways, they don't have as much industrial capacity as the enemies they think they're going to be fighting. At which point, if you can only physically build so many cruisers, it makes more sense to have those cruisers as powerful as you can possibly make them, rather than have fractionally more but considerably less powerful cruisers. Because the idea is if you have an 8-inch cruiser, if it stumbles across an American 8-inch cruiser, then it's got the advantage of surprise, they think, with their night fighting technology, so it should win. If you stumble across an American 6-inch cruiser, fantastic, even more chance of winning because it can hurt you somewhat less. Whereas if you flip that around and you have 6-inch cruisers going in, if they meet an American 6-inch cruiser, okay, with surprise they should still win. But if they meet an American 8-inch cruiser, they're worried they might not actually have enough time to put down an 8-inch cruiser, which at least in theory should possess some form of greater levels of protection against similar sized guns. And they're also aware that because they're packing so much firepower in terms of guns, torpedoes, and speed in terms of large machinery spaces, they are aware that if you have a a light cruiser, as we would call it, or for them a Type B. If an 8-inch cruiser gets off one decent salvo, that could be somewhat problematic for their continued survival. So, yeah, they have kind of given up the idea of the 6-inch fleet cruiser. And Agano, as we said, Agano and Yodo come about basically because they've decided that doctrinally they want flagships, which is interesting because it's a revival of an old concept that actually sees service in a number of different navies, because the original idea of scout cruisers, you actually have pre-World War One with the pre-World War One Arethusa class in the British Navy. You then have that with the Omahas in immediate post-World War One with the US Navy. And the Atlantas in the 1930s are also designed along this concept. Although the British, although they've kind of originated the idea amongst the great powers, they don't actually bring that idea back. They think about it a few times, but they don't actually get around to building a light cruiser as a flotilla leader. They do build flotilla leader destroyers. They build some fairly largish destroyers, the tribals and so forth. And they build the Didos, but obviously the Didos are not destroyer flotilla leaders, although ironically they end up being used as such in a few cases. And they also build the World War II period Arethusas, but again, those ships are not designed to be flotilla leaders. They're designed to be the minimum spec commerce protection cruisers. But the Japanese have kind of taken the ball a little bit late. And to be fair, they've already got some of their older, immediate post-World War I light cruisers assigned as destroyer flotilla leaders already. So it's not that they are lacking continuity in this train of thought. They've kind of picked up on it around the same time as the US did with the Omahas. But up until now, they've had enough light cruisers, older ones, to lead the various flotillas of destroyers. Now they're getting to a point where they're building more and more destroyer flotillas, and they don't have the light cruisers to lead them, hence the Aganos. And the Oyodos they're designed around this Japanese idea of the tripwire submarine line. So in some ways, it's kind of similar to German Wolfpack tactics, at least in very, very vague principles. But the Japanese idea of sub-operations was to have this line of submarines spread across the possible line of advance of the enemy. And then you'd have an Oyodo kind of backstopping them. And with its gun armament, that should be enough to see off, the occasional roving destroyer or small cruiser that might come forward of the enemy fleet. But those aircraft on the back and the command structure and the radio systems were designed so that the Oyodo could do the scouting, find where the enemy's coming from, and then radio that out to its submarine squadron and say, right, the enemy's over here. So, kind of, you guys over there need to move a bit to the left. You there need just a fraction to the right and concentrate the subs. So it's basically taking the role in a more formal manner that things like the Focke-Wulf FW200 Condor would do for the Kriegsmarine in the Battle of the Atlantic. Doesn't actually ever end up getting used in that role, really, but that was the idea, at least.
It's interesting that different navies came at this from different directions as well, because sort of France and Italy went more towards, we're going to build big destroyers rather than build small cruisers to fill that role.
Yeah, the Italians do end up building some small cruisers, the early classes of condottieri, but even then they are designed not as destroyer flotilla leaders, but as destroyer killers. Because, as you said, the French are building these big contre-torpilleurs. So the Italians are kind of looking at it going, well, the French are pushing the definition of destroyer towards the light cruiser. So we're going to build a light cruiser that is so small it kind of pushes towards the large destroyer, but is therefore still slightly superior. With the idea of knocking off the contre-torpilleurs. But it turns out that actually that kind of design role is pretty awkward, and you see the rest of the condottieris gradually start building up in size until the last of them are basically much more conventional light cruisers.
Well, stats-wise, I don't think it's going to be anything too wildly different from Yahagi.
No.
I mean, these are always initial stats, of course. But yeah, same gun caliber, almost the same range. I think it's going to be a little bit slower. I guess we'll have to wait and see if the ballistics are as floaty as the Yahagi. But yeah, I mean, Yahagi is an okay cruiser at tier 5. It doesn't have the most fans. It's only got 6 barrels.
Yeah.
And very limited torpedo arcs, but it's also got a nice array of consumables. So I guess we'll see if we'll see how Agano compares. I mean, Agano, it doesn't look like it's going to get the speed boost.
No,
it's still going to get a fighter. So
yeah, it's a decent enough. As you say, it's a decent enough design if somewhat on the smaller side to have a tier 5. So. Yeah, I don't see it being one of the game breakers at tier 5, but it's certainly not going to be the floating XP pinata that say something like Emerald is.
Yes,
which I mean, theoretically significantly outguns it, but in fact is more of just a floating pile of cordite.
Yeah, at least, I mean, it's not going to have quite the same oomph as with the engine boost, but 35 knots is still very good for a tier 5 light cruiser, and with the Sierra Mike flag, I think you can get that to nearly 37. Just checking my Yahagi now. Yeah, 36.8 knots. So it's going to be a speedy little cruiser at tier 5. I think the only thing that's in the same that's the same or faster is the Emile Bartin, which is like bonkers fast.
Yeah, I can still run it down with my repulse.
True.
And of course it can stealth torp.
Yes, true. It's got 12 kilometer torpedoes. I mean, if it still has the same awkward range, I guess we'll see how viable that is. But that is, I think, probably the best range of any cruiser at that tier.
It's even better than destroyers.
Yeah, for attacker's got 10. I think Marblehead's got 9.2. Trying to think what else has torps. All of them are kind of 4 to 6 kilometers. I think Montecuculi, I think that's 9 kilometers.
So
that's 10 kilometers, but they're very slow.
Good question. I think maybe 8.
I think Emerald is 8. I remember that got buffed at some point in the past. Yeah, Emerald, Exeter, Hawkins. Hawkins is 7 kilometers. So yeah, it's going to have, that's probably going to be the standout feature, is it's going to have those 12 kilometer torps, same as Yahagi. And being Japanese torpedoes, they do a pretty decent whack of damage, 17k.
Yeah. Well, they're big old things, so
yeah, they're the 610 millimeter ones. Most everyone else is using 533s.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the stats, the Agano has like almost 21k damage at tier 5 with 12 kilometer torps. Those torps are decent, or more than decent. Like the destroyers would kill to get those torps.
that would be unpleasant if you had a destroyer that had that torpedo armament at that tier.
We will see.
So, as you mentioned, there is one single the Oyodo class that came out after that. There was one single example that we don't have in game that I don't know. We might see as a premium at some point, but
yeah, that
has kind of a unusual turret setup.
Yeah, Oyodo's just 2 triples forward.
Which they may well be saving that for a premium. Just I can see why they didn't put it in the line, because it's unusual for a cruiser.
Yeah, it's going to be I have a feeling that it could go one of 2 ways, depending on the sort of the stop-start nature of submarine development. Because although Oyodo is designed as a submarine flotilla leader within the game, with a reasonable range of aircraft for its size slapped on its back, if submarines proliferated extensively in game, then Oyodo as a premium submarine hunter, maybe with a lot of either a lot or very fast recharging depth charge flights, because of its its aft-mounted aircraft might
That's an
be
idea, yeah.
something, or alternatively, it might just become, mini Tone.
Yes, yeah, that's the
Two
other
tiers
thing I was
down.
thinking. Tone is,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Which would be hilariously unrealistic, but then again, Tone launching torpedo bomber squadrons is already not exactly in
Yeah.
keeping with its historical use. So
I can't see
Yeah.
Wargaming making a submarine hunter. They like the submarines too much.
yeah. Although on the other hand, if you make a specialist submarine hunter that's only available for doubloons,
Yeah.
it's very, very potentially very profitable.
create the problem, sell the solution.
Mm-hmm. Oh dear.
So then we are on to the Tier 6, the Gokase.
Yes. So this is not a historical ship in terms of it was not constructed, but it is also kind of, at least on the main line, it is the last point at which we are engaged with a design that was actually mostly, if not fully, realized on paper. So this is an interpretation of Design C44, the improved Agano class. And that basically came about because they had the Aganos and then they were relatively happy with those. And initially, they were going to just build a few more. But then because they'd come up with Shimakaze, and Shimakaze was quite quick, and they wanted to build several flotillas of Shimakazes, they realized that you can't have a destroyer flotilla leader that is slower than the destroyers it's leading. So they said, right, we want basically a faster version of Agano so that it can keep up with the Shimakazes, which also, for the most part, obviously didn't end up being constructed. And so it was stretched, more machinery was stuck in, and at that point, because the displacement has gone up, the overall size has gone up, and it's getting a lot faster. It's like, well, effectively, we've got this spare space, we might as well stick another twin turret in. So it's longer, faster Agano with 8 twin mountings and a bunch of torpedo launchers amidships under the aircraft platform, but still basically the same design role as the Aganos, just somewhat faster.
Yeah, it does jump up to 37.5 knots base speed, so that is that's quite nippy.
Yep, it's got to keep up with the destroyers, and of course, because it's a destroyer flotilla leader, much as like Agano, I think this is where they're taking the idea of giving these things a powerful torpedo armament from, because the Japanese, well, they get fairly big torpedo armaments to all of their cruisers, but especially with the Agano and the improved Agano, they're thinking whereas the other newer cruisers are going to be operating with the destroyers, as in the same kind of attack wave. These ships in particular are going to be specifically part of the destroyer flotillas. They're going to be part of that initial attack wave, so they need to be able to contribute to the action as much as what is sort of coming with them. Hence the fairly extensive long lance batteries.
Yeah, I think that will make it the fastest. There's nothing quite as fast as the Emil Bartan at Tier 6, but there's a decent number of cruisers that have sort of 34, 35 knots, even a couple that are over 36 knots. So it's less stands out, but the speed is still quite nice to have. The gun characteristics look exactly the same, however.
Yes,
just
and
an extra turret.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is actually this is the last time we will see, again in the main line, well, actually at all, in this line, this is the last time we will see the 152mm gun, which is exactly 6 inches.
Yes.
And there's a reason for that, which is that the Agano and, in theory, its successors were basically being armed with older guns that the Japanese either still had lying around or were recovering from older ships from the period back when you still had the Anglo-Japanese alliance going on, and some ships were still being built in British yards. So at that point, they were therefore having ships with the same caliber as British guns, because often they were either buying them outright or license building them. So the 152mm is a British 6-inch caliber, and that's where these ships are getting their guns from. They're older weapons. The same reason why the Congos have a 14-inch gun, for example. But then, as the Japanese transition over to wholly constructing their own weaponry, they use metric, and so you start to see the change. So although we shorthand say Nagato has 16-inch and Yamato has 18-inch, they're actually not quite that.
Yeah,
because they're near enough to, but they're in whole millimeters rather than the odd numbers that the exact inch goes through to. And it's the same with the 6-inch guns. So once the Japanese start designing their own, they go from 152 to 155mm or 6.1 inch, and that's what we will see for the next, well, at least for the next ship or two. So because then that 155mm is what the Japanese put on Yamato, Megami, etc., etc. It's their modern 6-inch-ish gun.
Yeah, and it does explain why if these are all the guns, why the ballistics are so floaty with those 152s.
Yeah.
And I think they're going to be. I'm just going to double check this, but I think they're going to be the only Japanese ships in the game that use those 152s as a primary armament, alongside obviously Yahagi already being in the game.
Well,
because below that it's like 140mm, and above that we're getting the 155s.
Yeah, well, I think some of the 6-inch guns on the existing line are going to be 152s.
What guns did the Yubari have?
I'm pretty sure that's 140s. But I can't remember. I can just check though. Yubari is 140mm. Because at the moment, the existing line, you get up to basically everything below for attacker is the 140mm, and you have this big jump to for attacker with its 8-inch guns at tier 5. And then you always had Megami standing out as the Odyssey with the choice of either the 8-inch or the 155s. But now we're going to have a lot more 155s in the game.
Yes.
Yes.
So talking of 155s, let's move up to the tier 7 then.
Yes.
So this is the Omono.
Yeah, so at this point, we are now parting company on this main line of new ships with ships that the Japanese actually seriously considered building. The best thing you can say for Omono is that she kind of, if you squint at it, looks a bit like an Oyodo, but if Oyodo had been built as a full gun cruiser. So she's obviously got the 12 6-inch guns, 3 in 4 triple turrets, but effectively the aircraft handling area has been replaced by triple sixes, which is an interesting one. But
it's certainly going to have quite a few of those 6-inch barrels. Now, I presume they're going to behave mostly the same as Megami's 155s, because we've had those in the game for a long time. Also, I told a lie, by the way. Apparently, Chikuma at tier 2 uses 6-inch guns, so there we go.
Yeah, I was going to say some of the smaller ones will do as well.
But so let's bring up Megami then. Curious to see how this compares.
I mean,
because Megami's always been. I mean, it's entirely historical that it is an oddity with its 2 wildly different calibers of guns. But
yeah, well, as we said, she's kind of this attempt to not quite break the treaty restrictions, but be ready to break the treaty restrictions.
I think the only real equivalent I can think of is sort of Scharnhorst and Eisenhower with their 11 to 15-inch planned conversions.
Well, I mean, the conversions of Kitakami and Oi are basically the same thing.
Okay.
Because those conversions were actually planned before the war, but they kept them in. They kept them in their back pocket because, similar to the Megamis, their idea was, well, we'll give everyone this idea of this is what our force structure is, and then when war comes, we'll very quickly switch over, so we'll have a more powerful force structure, but they won't know that. And even if they do figure it out, it'll be in the middle of the war, so we'll still have a considerable advantage until such time as they develop their counters. Whereas if you converted it before the war, then people would see what was happening and could start making their own countermeasures earlier.
Yeah, I suppose, there's a certain degree of sense to that, but it also, I guess, complicates designing the things initially, and there's always going to be trade-offs, I suppose.
I mean,
Yeah.
how fast would it go, right? Because if a lot of those ships, if war breaks out, it's not like could you just wait there? Like we need 2-3 months to just switch over our guns.
Well, I mean, Kitakami and Ois, which were obviously a considerably more involved replacement than Megamis in some ways, they were converted, relatively speaking, quickly. But you're still talking broadly in terms of by the time you've taken the ship out of service, brought it in, swapped out whatever weapons you're going to swap out, recommissioned it, tested it, and got your new crew experienced enough to operate it in a battle line, you're probably talking about at least a year around about. So it's the kind of thing where if you know you're about to go to war, like say, I don't know, if you're planning a sneak attack on a massive enemy fleet base, then you start laying the plan. You'd have all the material in place already, and then you start your refits 4, 6, 8 months before you plan to go to war, so that they're just starting to come online around about the time that your biggest surprise attack fleet has gotten back, refitted itself, and is ready to go out in major combat again. Because as far as everyone else is concerned, you've just brought some ships in for refit, which serves, well, it's this dual purpose thing. One is no one suspects you're going to do this until it's actually finished, so the fact that you brought them in doesn't really mean much on an intelligence scale. And two, it actually helps to, in some ways, deceive your opponents as to what your intentions are, because if you are planning for war, what they would expect you to be doing is holding off on refits and surging ships out, basically having the maximum number of ships ready to go. Whereas if you pull a bunch of ships in for refits, that suggests, oh, this is just business as normal. But in actual fact, you're rearming everything. So yeah, it was a cunning enough plan by the Japanese. It just turned out it didn't matter all that much. And yeah, just looking quickly at some photos of Oyodo in service. Yeah, the Omono is almost literally a Yodo back to the aft of the funnel, and then just rebuilt with a gun armament instead of a seaplane armament. So it's it's not historical, but it's
plausible.
It's plausible. It's based off of a historic ship. It's kind of, what if the Japanese had gone, actually, we want more Class Bs instead of a Class C? Well, we've already got this design. Let's tweak it a bit. So, yeah.
I mean, interestingly, sorry.
It'll be interesting though, because it's Yodo was not the world's biggest cruiser. It's not like a full 10,000 ton standard displacement treaty cruiser. So cramming in 12 guns and heavy torpedo armament, etc., onto this thing, it'd be interesting to see what they've what's been dropped to make that viable, or have they gone with the kind of, the rule of paper ships, in that they can sometimes outperform real world ships because
Possibly.
No one's not being built. You don't get a chance to see what their weaknesses are.
I mean, it is a lot slower.
Yes.
I'll say a lot slower. It's still 33 knots, and I mean, in game, we don't have to worry about things like ships being top heavy, which, of course, a lot of Japanese designs were. You don't really have to worry about stability in that way.
Yeah, it's
so. Yeah,
I mean, it's not the only ship in that kind of displacement range for people to try and cram 12 guns on. The Crown colonies, the Fiji being the other obvious example, but then again, the Fijis were known for being cramped and not having a lot of room for upgrades. And by the time it came to stick radar and more AA guns on and everything, an awful lot of them lost the super firing aft turret to make stability and room for all these additional weapons. And obviously, in this case, this ship is carrying a similar level of armament, but it's in terms of main guns, but it's also carrying a significantly heavier secondary armament in terms of those torpedoes.
I mean, it's interesting that I feel like I wonder what the ship would have been used for, right? Because with the Agano, obviously the ship existed, right? And then the Kokase, there was a plan how the Japanese wanted to use it, and it's reflected in the stats, right? It's relatively fast. Even has some amazing surface detectability, which obviously is not a realistic number, but it would fit in with the idea that it's might be together with smaller ships that might be leading around the destroyers. And then you have the Omono, which they just go to, I'd say, standard wargaming cruiser stats, right? It has like a unremarkable speed, an unremarkable turning circle, unremarkable detection range, and just, your standard amount of guns.
It does actually have quite a good range for 6-inch guns. I have to say, at tier 7 especially, I mean, it outranges the Megami with the 6-inch guns. I think even with the heavy guns, it outranges Megami. I've also looked; it is the same shell stats as Mogami, so we know roughly how these 155s will perform. One unusual thing is the torpedoes, actually. 13-kilometer range, up to 23, almost 24k damage, but only 57 knot speed. I don't think there's any other 13-kilometer torpedoes on the Japanese line. That's an unusual number. And to have those that heavier torpedo at tier 7 as well, I mean, that is that's going to be nasty if you get hit by those.
Definitely. And
you should still be able to you will be able to stealth drop even without concealment expert. Well, it's not a big gap, but it looks like a lot of these will be able to stealth torpedo, which is not a common characteristic on a lot of cruisers.
Yeah, and especially if you also stealth build them.
Yes. It is. I hadn't actually noticed that the tier 6 is really sneaky. I mean, I don't know if it's going to stay that sneaky, but 9.5 kilometers base concealment, which is a huge jump down from the rather, still decent, but rather more standard 11.1 on the Agano. Considering it's a bigger ship, that is unusually sneaky.
I feel like they're really embraced with the stats, the design philosophy of this ship leading destroyers in a sense, because it has the speed and almost like the concealment to stick with them.
So we've definitely moved away from that with the Omono. Definitely not a destroyer leader.
The Omono is something where I don't think wargaming, because it's a ship that they made up. There was no historical way it would have been used. So they were just like, well, the Japanese probably wouldn't build this anyway, so we just do whatever.
Yeah, it's definitely moved away from the actual sort of naval philosophy, if you like, of Japan's doctrine. That's the word I'm looking for there, the doctrine. Also, I was going to say what you were saying about Japan actually kind of planning ahead for this sort of thing. I'm sure there were, if they'd have been thinking of it in those terms, there would have been people in the Kriegsmarine sort of enviously going, you guys were planning ahead?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, they were kind of operating under the assumption there wasn't like, oh, there's be war eventually, but it's fine. We'll have like another decade to build up the fleet before we do anything nuts like go to war with, the rest of Europe and Russia at the same time. Yeah. So yeah, that is actually going to be among the better ranges of Tier 7 cruisers generally. A lot of them don't have great ranges necessarily, and Japanese cruisers tend not to. So that's going to be a bit of an outlier. Jaws, that's 11.3. Is there any other light cruiser that has that kind of range? Don't think so. Most of them are kind of 15, 16 kilometers. Some of them kind of even less than 15 kilometers.
I mean, we'll have to wait and see how the ballistics turn out if you actually can be useful at that range.
I mean, I remember, I haven't played it in a while, but I remember Megami with the 155s being reasonably okay. Like not the kind of floaty 152s that that's so notable on Yahagi.
Yeah, because it's the newer 155 gun, and I remember way back in the day when it was back when you just had the Japanese and the Americans in the game, and for a considerable time thereafter, there was actually a considerable movement in favor of using the Megami with its 155s and basically not bothering with the 203s until you had to just steam through the upgrade to get to the next tier.
They actually, they nerfed. They kind of repeatedly nerfed the 155s to try and get people to. For a while, you had like basically Battleship turret traverse on the 155 mils for no other reason than to make them awkward to use.
Yeah.
They will have, as Yusrul is noting in the chat. Hello, Yusrul, by the way. This will have a very slow rate of fire for a 6-inch gunned ship, though 12.5 seconds. We're getting into heavy cruiser rate of fire, so you're going to have the range, but you're not going to have the rate of fire. Even the tier 6 is the tier 5 and the tier 6-inch guns are kind of on the slow side at 9-second reload, which is again what Yahagi has. So Omono is not going to be a fast firing ship, but you'll have better range to play with and presumably decent stealth. So
I mean, what the thing with the 155 is it's quite hard hitting, but it does have a very large. It's not quite American in its shell weight, but it has a fairly heavy shell, and also has quite a heavy amount of propellant charge, so it kicks out the shell at a very high speed. But as with a lot of other high-speed weapons, whether they be Italian 8-inch or Italian 15-inch guns, or even German 15-inch, when with the semi-automated loading mechanisms broke down, they turn out to be somewhat slower firing because they have this considerably increased weight of total all-up weight, propellant and charge put together, which is then much more difficult proportionally for everybody to handle and load, especially when you're talking about cruisers, whereas with battleships, a lot of it is kind of hand guided but semi-automated. On a lot of cruisers, there's still a lot more manual work involved.
This might be an unfair question, but I don't know. You've got the book in front of you. What would be the sort of in practical terms the difference in handling between a 152 and a 155 mil shell? I mean, is it going to be fairly minimal, or is it kind of more than one would expect?
Notionally, if you were using kind of average weight of shell, it wouldn't be all that different. I mean, it's 3 mil. Okay, that's a volumetric increase, but it's not going to make a huge amount of difference in and of itself. But the American 6-inch, which is what a 152 millimeter shell, is actually a heavier shell than the Japanese 155. But what you've got to remember is that when you're talking about 6-inch shells, they are beginning to approach the limit of what is comfortably handleable by humans. This was actually one of the problems, even with the 5.25-inch, the British World War II gun, which was that in a heavy seaway and with a very sort of pitching, rolling ship, which again, light cruisers tend to be, 5.25, 5.5, 6, 6.1 inch, you are, even if you split it into shell and charge, you are beginning to approach the upper limit of what a single person in an active environment can handle without either causing themselves injury because they get knocked over, or they start to slow down because they have to be very careful about what they're doing. Which is one of the reasons why a lot of 6-inch guns at this point, in fact, pretty much all of them are using separate shells and charges, because that brings the weight of any single thing you have to transport or carry down, possibly even below the weight of a 4.7 or 5-inch single combined shell. But it's still not a nice thing to be handling, especially because, of course, if you're firing semi-armor piercing or armor piercing, depending on the nation in question, it's not just about weight; it's also about density. Because if you're carrying, if you're carrying something big, something that you can kind of almost bear hug of a given weight, if it's whatever arbitrarily, let's say weight 40 kilos, but it's something you can just grab like this and carry, you can actually, in terms of body mechanics, you can deal with that a lot better than someone gives you a little lump of metal like this that weighs 40 kilos and says, carry that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, handling shells is not a pleasant experience. Certainly not any considerable size.
Yeah, I suppose you wouldn't want to. What's the upper body equivalent of leg day? I don't know, but you wouldn't want to skip that.
No, I mean, considering that these days, like modern guidance on handling handling weights is, I think it's like 20 kilos is advisable under health and safety guidance. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that is completely out the window when you're looking at these things. The shell is a lot heavier than that. It's about 20 years, almost 3 times, 2.5 to 3 times as much, depending on which 6-inch gun you're looking at.
Okay. So that is I think that might be the only 155, because we're going on to
Shimanto.
150 millimeter guns after
that.
Now, what's the provenance of the 150 millimeter?
Yes, that's an interesting one. I mean, it's disappointing. To me, it's disappointing on 2 levels. I believe, from what I've seen, although I wouldn't say don't quote me on this, but hey, we're doing a stream, so obviously people will. But yeah, I believe it's the theory on Wargaming's logic is that the Japanese Navy would have wanted a newer, faster firing, higher performance weapon, and the Japanese Army has a 150mm anti-aircraft gun that could then be turned dual purpose. Okay. And then they've just kind of gone, yeah, we're having that. Which, in theory, in general theory of an army adopting a naval weapon or a navy adopting an army weapon, isn't entirely without precedent.
But we're talking the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Army.
Yes. So. Yeah, we're talking about organizations that sometimes would have weapons produced in the same factory, but would have a physical divider with armed guards on both sides in that factory, despite ostensibly being on the same side.
Yes. So this is the Japanese Army that had their own aircraft carriers and all their own airplanes that were completely different from what the Navy had. And
I mean, sure. I mean, in theory, yes, I can see the Japanese Navy possibly acquiring a new gun design from the Japanese Army, but it would probably be either via espionage or bloody massacre, not polite request.
Yeah.
The other thing that slightly disappoints me about the fact, well, one, they've transitioned over to this 150 battery, but also the fact that we're now entering into, with the fact it's armed with 150s, we are actually entering into a fantasy area, because there are actually, notionally speaking, two slight design variants of ships which they could maybe have introduced into 7 and 8, or also 8 and 9, which would have been early versions of Tone. Because I mean, we all know and love the premium Tone with its all forward armament. But Tone is, of course, post dates Megami, but is still a very early 1930 ship. The original design requirements for Tone were laid down in 1933, which is partly explains that then you've got this massive gap up to Agano historically. And originally, Tone was kind of a repeat improved Megami. So 15 155mm guns in a layout which is basically what we get at with this Shimanto. So you've got kind of the Megami upper deck super firing layout forward, as opposed to the more Nelson-like super firing B turret, which you got on the earlier Japanese ships, and of course on Agano-Takao, and then your two turrets aft. So if they'd done basically this, but with 155s, and said this is kind of the original, I think it's C-38 cruiser design, the Tone sub-variant, early version, that would have been more historically accurate. I have a feeling they've gone for this notional 150 purely because they want the to be able to say it's dual purpose, which the 155 very definitely isn't. I mean, you look at the Omono, and you can even see by the modeling that the openings in the turrets that allow the guns to elevate are significantly smaller than you have on this Shimanto. You can see the elevation cuts go right back, which would indicate this theoretical turret is able to fire kind of 70-80 degrees or so vertically, thus the dual purpose. Which, when then you look down the side, and you're like, yeah, that's probably necessary for this theoretical ship to survive, because there ain't that much in terms of secondary anti-aircraft armament down the side. But it is a little disappointing that they've kind of you can understand to a certain extent why, because of the air threat you get by tier 8, but it's kind of so close. Or the other alternative they could have done was that was the original Tone design. Then Tone went through one more design revision before you got historical Tone, which was when they decided to turn it into a scouting cruiser. So it acquired what in game on Tone in game is this torpedo bomber launcher on the back. In real life was a scout aircraft launcher array, but when they did that design, they moved it to the 4 turrets forward, and those 4 turrets were triple 155s. And then when they decided, actually, stuff it, we're not doing this treaty nonsense anymore, the design got revised again to twin 203s, and then that's how you get Tone. So, I mean, if it was up to me, and I was trying to stick close-ish to Japanese designs, because obviously these were concepts, they weren't anywhere near as fully fleshed out as the improved Aganos were. But if I was going to be doing this at tier 8, I would actually be tempted to go with the all forward, the 4 triple 155s all forward. So I'm retaining the same armament as you'd have at tier 7 with a mono, but you're able to bring it to bear a little bit more without exposing the side of your ship. You can still have your torpedo armament, and then instead of having aircraft launchers on the back, you could then take a leaf out of the historical Oyodo career, which was, by the end of the war, she wasn't launching aircraft anymore. They just absolutely plastered her in 25mm guns, a lot of which were arranged in massive nests aft. So then you could have had your 12-gun armament forward and then said, okay, well, in theory, if they had built this vessel and it had come into service in this way, then by the end of the war, she probably would have just scrapped the aircraft and just cover the thing in light AA, which would be interesting because I mean, tier 8 we are talking about what Cleveland, Edinburgh, is Edinburgh at tier 8?
Yes.
It is,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
Bayard, maybe that was kind of like a AA design, wasn't it?
So you wouldn't be looking at being outgunned in the light cruiser department. You're still talking 12 6-inch guns or thereabouts, but just with a slightly unusual armament layout and arc of fire, and then this very interesting kind of in the event of enemy aircraft turn tail and run away, and hope that this absolutely insane battery of light AA can do something, which would have been an interesting ship to play with, as well as being slightly closer to historical reality. And then at tier 9, you could stick in, the original Tone concept of 15 guns, and then go, okay, well now we've got our 15 gun armament, which is a one triple turret better. Therefore, it has more main battery guns. You'd have to come up with something to deal with the relative lack of anti-aircraft armament at that point. But then this is a light cruiser tech tree split, so maybe that's its weakness. It doesn't have good AA cover, because at that point it'll have speed, it'll have good torpedo armor, it'll have a decent broadside. It's just not particularly good at defend itself from aircraft.
Let's be honest, none of them will defend themselves from aircraft.
No, I mean they stand a lot better than the heavy cruisers for the most part, but the Japanese heavy cruisers are not good AA ships at all for the most part. So
which is in keeping with historical reality.
Yeah, they're certainly going to be better tier for tier than their counterparts. They are supposed to be a bit more AA focused generally, which maybe explains why they've taken this entirely hypothetical navalized 150mm gun to use as dual purpose.
Well, I mean, in the Circle 5 and Circle 6 programs, there was allocation for some Class C anti-aircraft cruisers, but they were kind of, this is what we'd like to build, but by the time they actually got around to whatever mutilated form Circle 5 turned into, they were gone. Mm-hmm. So they were at best back of the napkin designs, as opposed to, this is kind of Megami, but not quite.
Yeah, just looking at the DPS, so they're going to be possibly comparable to American light cruisers, actually. I mean, there's Shimanto with the DPS it puts out, 9.6 kilometer range. Once upon a time, that would have been, that's a Japanese Cleveland, but of course, we know what Cleveland's AA is worth or not worth these days. So they'll be good for cruisers, but they're not necessarily going to have that much stopping power.
I remember the era where a Cleveland was actually a decent AA.
Oh yeah. I've got a game up on my channel somewhere before the Captain, I think it was the very first big Captain rework. And when manual AA used to, be an absolute monstrous skill to have in certain cruisers. And I think it's a game where I'd even forgotten to take defensive, but it didn't matter because I had manual AA and I was still shooting everything out of the sky regardless.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is when you look at the overall form of Shimanto, especially the very heavily raked trunked funnel, in a lot of ways you can kind of see that this thing is Tone in some way, just struggling to come out.
It does. Like, the whole form is not complete nonsense. Like, you compare it to the kind of hulls that Megami and Tone and even Otago, although that's more the higher tier ones. More like the Otago and Takao. But yeah, the ships are fictional, but they're not totally strange looking, like
No.
some other
But
fictional ships we have.
they are not
This-
Setons.
Cristoforo Colombo, for example.
Yeah. This is almost first concept turn A,
hmm
but with this ahistorical 150 instead of the 155mm battery. And then and then you've got the Tier 9 Takahashi, which is just like, I mean, I haven't seen the detailed stats breakdown, but
it does have stats at the bottom that you can take a gander out of that page. One thing to note is that the 155s are definitely inferior in terms of damage, but they do have pretty good range for a light cruiser without needing any kind of like spotter plane or any kind of boost. So what the ballistics of these 150s is going to be like is definitely a mystery. We don't have anything like that in the game at the moment, I don't think. I mean, there's the German 150s, but I don't think they'll have the same ballistics somehow. As long as they're not as floaty as the American 6-inch guns, I suppose.
Yeah.
Because they can be very hard to use at long ranges.
Yeah, I'm just kind of looking at it now. It's main battery. There you go. Firing range 18.7 kilometers.
You can actually glance up and compare them to the Tier 7. So slightly less damage, actually slightly more fire chance, which is interesting. Slightly higher initial velocities.
Which would make sense in that it's kind of it's a dual-purpose gun, but adapted from an anti-aircraft artillery piece, at least notionally. So it would be firing with that slightly higher velocity. Reload time's gone up, which I'm sure
heavy cruise reload time at that point, 14 seconds.
Yeah, that's not going to make it very popular.
No.
Well, the 15-kilometer torps.
Yeah, again, they seem to be progressing the torpedo ranges almost like not quite the same as the German destroyer line, where you just have this quite orderly progression of the torps getting steadily longer range, which is not that usual for most lines. But yeah, they seem to be putting an emphasis on the torpedoes on these.
Yeah, and the surface detectability is only a hair above 11 kilometers, so there's actually quite a broad range for stealth torping in here. In some ways, it almost feels to me like this thing is, it's kind of almost similar to the original line Japanese destroyers. You're supposed to run in stealth torp, and whatever guns you have are more of a I fire these in general annoyance at you while I run away if you happen to detect me weapons. You're not really expected to be winning any gun duels with them.
They're certainly like these are pretty standard in terms of their HE pen as well. So it's not like the German 150mm where you've got that built-in IFHE. So if you want, you're either going to have to go. I mean, you can completely ignore IFHE and try and focus on setting fires, or you can take IFHE and try and get more damage, but you can't really have both.
Yeah.
So as to those guns, we'll have to wait and see. But the torpedoes do look interesting. I mean, I think it's been a flat 2-minute reload for the torpedoes since the Tier 5. And again, that might change, but that's not too bad for a cruiser. And considering, again, these are high damage torpedoes with a long range.
And you get more of them. Like at Tier 9, you have 4x4 already. Like the lower tiers, they have like 2x4. It's also interesting that the torpedoes change. Like originally, the lower tiers, they do like 60 knots or so. And then at some point, it switches to 57.
But that's not that much slower considering the range of these torpedoes. I mean, how does that compare to the... Is that what the...
They are also 100 meters easier detected. So basically the speed goes down, the detectability goes up. So you have, in that sense, sneakier more deadly torps at the lower tiers.
Yeah, they're more kind of conventional at the lower tiers, and then at the higher tiers, we're getting more towards. Let me just pull up the stats of the 20-kilometer torpedoes, which is what, 2.5 kilometers on those. So they're not as bad as that. They're kind of splitting the difference between the 12-kilometer and the 20-kilometer torps. But they actually do more damage than the 20-kilometer torps as well. So we'll see. Those might be nasty to come up against. So we've kind of then we started to talk about the Tier 9, the Takahashi, which does look rather similar to the Tier 8.
Yeah, they've kind of said it's just an upgrade. What's it? An upgraded version with slightly more torpedoes and anti-aircraft. Which, I mean, they've given it quad launchers instead of triples, so there's a few more torpedoes in the water. But
firepower's the same, barely an increase in hit points.
Yeah, slightly increased surface detectability, but the AA, I mean, technically yes, it's an improvement. The AA guns have the 100 mils have a slightly longer range, but I'm kind of looking at it and going, yes, in theory, you've significantly increased the number of 25. Well, actually, not that much increase the number of 25 mils, but they've thrown on a couple of 40 mils. So presumably, this is reflecting some of, maybe this ship is going out with some of the very small stock of 40 millimeter Bofors that Japan had for various reasons by the mid to late part of World War II. So yes, in theory, that's an improvement, because to be honest, having some 40 mil Bofors aboard would be a vast improvement of almost any arbitrary number of 25s. But as you said earlier, let's face it, in game, your light medium AA really doesn't actually account for all that much when it comes to defending yourself against air attack.
Yeah, it might whittle down more planes over time, but for any individual strike, it doesn't actually matter. I'm just looking at it in terms of DPS numbers, though. It's at Tier 9, I think that's going to be comparable to the Dutch, which were another line of cruisers which are supposed to have good AA.
It introduces introduces a mid-range band,
which actually makes you weaker.
Yeah, the mid-range band is there, which presumably is these 40 mils, and then you have a slightly less powerful close-range band.
Yeah, people are really going to have to loiter their planes over for you to over your ship to have any significant effect, unless they fly into your flak, you know.
Yeah,
but that's not so hard to avoid. So so they've taken the fictional ship and gone, what if fictional ship, but a slight upgrade?
Slightly better, yeah. Which is, as I say, it's a little disappointing. I would have been very interested to see the two actual Tornaves variants, as I described earlier, because then, along with a Yoda, with kind of what if a Yoda was a full surface firepower ship, that would actually have taken us up to Tier 9 with plausible, if not fully fleshed out historical designs. But such is life.
I have a feeling that they just wanted to stick very traditional gun layout, not do anything experimental and so on. And maybe they didn't want to put in the work. They went like, hey, this looks vaguely like a Japanese cruiser, and we just place the amount of guns on it that we want and make up the stats that we want, and we just make it as linear as we can with no odd ducks.
I suppose from their point of view, that's something of a benefit, because they're not having to work around the exigencies of actual designs and trying to fit them in a coherent line.
Although they did have to go and invent an entire new gun, so
yes,
swings and roundabouts on that one.
It is. I mean, actually, the Tier 10, the Yodo, and you know what everyone's going to nickname that as.
Yes.
That actually has a shorter range. Interestingly, that's uncommon for it to lose range. But of course, tier 9, tier 10, you're going to have the option to extend that. But it's going to have 6 triple turrets. So
I think this makes it technically the most heavily armed light cruiser in the game.
Yeah, I think it will be. We have things like Venezia that have a lot of turrets, but yeah, I don't think we have any light cruisers that are really comparable to that. I mean, Venezia's only 5 triple turrets even, so yeah, that's going to be a hefty broadside, but again, it's a heavy cruiser reload.
Yeah. Maximum dispersion slightly less, although you're losing a little bit on range as well.
Yeah.
So you get a fairly nice alpha strike against other people, but you're going to be waiting quite a bit for your next salvo.
Yes, I mean, 14 seconds unmodified, that's sort of almost 3/4 of the way to stealthing up again at that point.
I'd almost wonder if the way to use the Yoda would be possibly even be to, if you want to get in a gunfight, would maybe be to ripple fire off the turrets. That would bring you a little bit closer to your reloading your first turret, which might then be a little bit more discouraging to people if you've got this series of triple salvos, triple shells coming in, rather than just, oh look, there's a huge salvo, and now we're waiting.
One thing, I mean, in comparison to the long reload, they do have all very, very quick turret traverses, 8, 9, and 10. Extremely quick. I mean, you go from tier 7 with 36-degree turret traverse, which is on the long side for a light cruiser, and then suddenly it's at tier 8, it's 6 seconds. And that's like, is the Worcester even that fast? I'm going to have to check. But that's on the tier of like the Minotaur and the Worcester and yeah, Minotaur I think slightly faster.
Yeah.
Smolensk must be around about, yeah, Smolensk is 6 seconds. So that's a very snappy turret response. There's times when that's going to be useful, but it's less useful than if you have fast turret traverse plus fast firing gun.
Like yeah, I was going to say, if I was facing off against this thing in my Minotaur, I don't think I'd be too worried.
Yes.
It'd just be like, okay, I know you've got one big alpha strike. Come on, give it to me while I'm angled, because it's still 150 millimeter. I've got a reasonable chance of bouncing a lot of it. And then as soon as you've sent off that big broadside, I'd be like, right, now it's my turn. I literally have the time at this point to turn myself a bit more broadside to unveil my guns and probably get 3 or 4 salvos off.
Yeah,
before I have to turn back again.
3 and a bit seconds on the Minotaur. So that's almost 5 salvos.
Yeah, and then
potentially
factor in a bit of wiggle room to sort of either make your turn in or begin your turn out to get to deflect the next salvo, and of course, even while you're angled, you're still going to have some of the forward guns firing. So, yeah, this thing ain't winning any gun contest. And okay, Worcester is not quite as agile as Minotaur, but it's a little bit more durable. And against 6-inch shells, the armor might actually mean something if you're somewhat angled. So yeah, I don't think against the other tier 10 fast firing cruisers, this isn't going to be the ship you want to be in, unless someone tries to literally engage you in a broadside combat with the Minotaur, because at that point, that many shells, you'll probably catch a few citadels.
I mean, even that reload, even versus a lot of the heavy cruisers, you are sort of at best on parity, if not slightly worse. I mean, I think that tier 10, certainly a lot of them actually fire faster than, I mean, there are ones like Goliath that fire slower, but let's see, Henri Quatre's 240mm guns that reload in 13 seconds. Petro reloads in 12 and a bit seconds.
And to be honest, if you're going broadside against a Goliath, slightly slower firing rate's probably not going to save you.
Yeah.
I mean,
Nevsky 180mm guns reload in 6 seconds, so...
You also have the problem of massive turning circle and rudder shift time, so you can't wiggle like most cruisers do. You can't turn in, fire your guns, and then turn back, right? If you turn, That's
Torpedoes.
It is fairly. I think the rudder shift more so than the turning radius. The turning radius is fairly bad, but not exceptionally bad for tier 10. Although having said that, even things like Venezia's 760 meters, they're sort of under 800 meters. So yeah, actually, it is actually fairly bad. Zhao's 840. There we go. So there are other ones that are Yoshino over 900 meters. So it is pretty bad, actually. But there are worse. I think the Soviet cruisers are all rather worse, apart from Smolensk.
Yeah, torpedoes are basically unchanged from tier 9, but your surface detectability has gone up by a kilometer. So you've still got that stealth talk window, and even more so if you stack on the concealment bonuses. But it's a lot narrower at this point, and obviously you're going to be a considerably larger vessel. So
what's also interesting is that they slightly changed like the turret layout. Like now the middle turret is elevated from the front three.
yeah, so you look at the pyramidal superstructure as well. This is basically some variant of an Agano to dash to cow. It's that kind of generation of Japanese ship design, but been through a lot.
Have that very distinctive kind of angled bridge structure.
Yeah, not entirely sure what to make of that, to be honest. But
so we'll see how these play. I mean, I think light cruiser lines generally are, unless they've got some amazing gimmick, they tend to be sort of less popular overall. But yeah, they're going to have. I think they're going to have range as that's going to be sort of like the range and the torpedoes are going to be their defining characteristic. I mean, if you compare them to the last light cruiser we had, which was the Pan-Asians, those all have much shorter ranges, but of course they've got the smokes as well.
Yeah,
and even then, with the much shorter ranges, it's not like they have amazing rates of fire.
No, I mean, again, if I was going to design this as a tier 10, if I was following my previous design principles of taking from the hypothetical subvariants on Tonei's actual design, what I would have done with this one is taken my hypothetical tier 8, i.e. the four turrets forward with the scouting aircraft or AA bat nest aft, and gone, okay, kind of similar to what they've done with the Iodo design, and gone, okay, well, we'll remove that aft element and just stick a pair of triples on the back, because that would still have gotten you your 6 triples, which is what they've got here. But it would have been a very interesting layout with 4 forward, 2 aft. And again, it would have been kind of one step, maybe 2 steps removed from reality, because it would have been it would have been like the previous, the last but one actual Tonei design, but then modified. But it still would have had a bit of a stronger root in historical reality. Although again, in my version, I would have kept the 155s, but such is life. Can't always have what we want.
Well, that needs to be your next project, clearly. Make your own game with ships.
Yeah, if only I had 3D modeling
World of
skills.
Drac ships. I'd play it.
Yeah.
So then we have one last Japanese cruiser, which is a bit of a silly-looking thing. Takachi at tier 7, which is a full attacker hull, but with 127mm dual-purpose guns in 6 turrets. Does this have any historical basis whatsoever? Because I'm going to guess no.
Yeah, no. I mean, the closest thing I could find that maybe would match up for this would be, again, in Japanese Pacific Cruise, I'm just looking at it now. So in the same section as it describes the Tenryu and Yubaris, there is an 8,000-ton scout cruiser design that is supposed to have 5 or 6, possibly, twin turrets with Type 3 140mm guns on the centerline. mounts in a pyramid arrangement with 3 turrets forward and 2 or 3 aft. So that's kind of this arrangement that we can see here. Alternative arrangement was considered with the new 50 caliber 20 centimeter or 7.9 inch guns, and then you've got two twin torpedo mounts either side. So if they'd gone for the 5, well, they're saying 6 twin turrets. Oh yeah, 6. So basically, if they'd gone with the 6 twin turret version, so they've got 2 sets of pyramidal type gun mounts with this theoretical 8,000-ton cruiser design from 1918, and then at some point refitted it with 127 mils instead of the 140s that they would have originally installed on it, you could end up with something along this line. But yeah, that's about the closest I could find.
Okay.
So yeah, kind of similar layout, but very different. Obviously, very different armament.
As far as I can tell, it's pretty much just a copy of the most prevalent Japanese 127 mil destroyer gun, the third year type, as opposed to the Hayate's faster firing ones. So I mean, it's not a bad broadside. Those Japanese destroyer guns do a decent amount of damage, but it's also got the reload of a Japanese destroyer as well at 7 seconds. So yeah, it's not necessarily terribly impressive. And of course, transporting a tier 5 hull, even a relatively well armored for tier 5 hull up to tier 7, when suddenly you can see tier 9s. Yeah, that's. I'm not entirely sure what the idea behind this one is, other than let's stick in a premium to go with this new line.
I mean, it's kind of like almost a Japanese Atlanta in some ways.
Kind of, I guess. I think they are supposed to be dual purpose, aren't they? These 127s.
Oh yeah, rapid fire dual purpose artillery. So it's in the ballpark, albeit not with quite the same rate of fire.
But having said that, it's still not particularly good AA.
No.
I mean,
In fact, that might actually be worse AA than the Tech Tree line tier 7. Pretty sure it is. Yeah, by quite a margin, actually.
Where are your top launches? Do you have like they say they have 2 top launchers with 3 torps each, but are they like one on each side, or could they go both ways?
I mean, I would have assumed they were like for attackers, but they might have.
You can see one on the broadside in the picture in the blog. How many is it supposed to be carrying?
2 times 3.
Okay, so it's 1 on each broadside from the looks of it.
Because it do get a torpedo reload booster, so it seems like they want to push the torpedo angle simply some more. But even with a reload booster, if you only have 3 per side, that's not really gonna give you much.
Yeah, I mean, for attacker, there's 2 quad mounts, so it looks like they
stole a torpedo.
Yeah, they've stolen a torpedo. It does have slightly longer range. 12 kilometers versus 10. I think they are otherwise the same torpedoes, though. 1.6. Slightly worse detectability, but same damage. I mean, for attack, at least we can say has good torpedo drop angles, and hopefully this will be the same. I can't see why it would be any different. But yeah, I'm not convinced about this as a tier 7. I guess we'll see.
If you charge around using it as a large destroyer, you might get away with something.
It would have to have better surface detectability for that, though. I mean, 11.8.
Yeah.
It's not bad, but it's not the super sneaky, ridiculously sneaky surface detection that the tier 6, the Gokasi, has. So,
I mean, for a ship that size is actually pretty bad concealment, right? I mean, this is a pretty small ship.
Yeah,
It must be about what the Furataka has. Let me center reserve 11.9 for Furataka without the captain's skill. So it's just very slightly better than the Furataka. So you can get it to like 10.6 kilometers, which is not terrible, but considering it's only got 13.6 firing range, that's a pretty narrow window of getting close enough to something and remaining unspotted before you start opening fire.
You'd expect to be at 10 or below, like between 9 and 10, I would expect for a ship like that.
We have other short-range cruisers at that tier, like Atlanta, but they tend to have rather better concealment.
Atlanta's like 10.6 base.
Yeah, you can get Atlanta to under 10. I'm trying to think what else there is that's like that. Chumphon, I think, is the only other 127 mil. And that will go down to also 9.3. So, yeah, that's going to be awkward. That's going to be very awkward.
We shall see. I mean, those are preliminary stats.
Yeah, preliminary stats. They might revise that. Hopefully, they'll revise that. I guess we'll see. I mean, in theory, I'm not against having a nice big broadside of those Japanese 127 mils, because even on the destroyers, they can be quite nasty potentially. They're just rather slow firing, but the problem is these are also rather slow firing for those destroyer caliber guns. So yeah, I don't know if they were going to slap a smoke on it or something like that. I could kind of see them having the rest of these stats, but it doesn't. It's got the torpedo reload booster and it's got a fighter, and that's it.
Yeah, so. I've just kind of gone through the entire lifetime and modification of the Furutakas themselves, and at least according to Japanese cruisers of the Pacific War, they were always looking at the modernizations being in terms of replacing the old 7.9s with the more modern 8-inch guns that you found on the later big Japanese heavy cruisers. There's not really any mention, at least in my speed read, of anything to do with turning the Furutakas into effectively AA ships. So,
I think if they'd given it Hayate's 127 mils, that might have been interesting.
I mean, I can see the Japanese in an alternate timeline where they actually took air defense a little bit more seriously, maybe going for this, because otherwise the Furutakas don't really have a lot going for them.
It's not completely inconceivable to downgun a design like that, but
I mean, the mention of anti-air is hilarious because the in-game stats, like I'm just looking now at the in-game anti-air stats, and oh boy, is it bad.
It is actually pretty bad, considering it's supposed to be, they make a point of it. Oh, it's got dual-purpose main battery. Yeah, well, good luck getting them to fly into your flag, because the DPS otherwise is pretty terrible.
So bad might start shooting your own ship.
100, not even quite 150 DPS on a tier 7 cruiser, which is probably, is that even comparable to the Miyokos? Because Miyokos have pretty bad AA. Slightly better than Miyoko. That's not saying much.
No. I mean, it's as you got the British C-class AA refits, and even the proposed refits for the D-class. So the idea of taking an old cruiser and going, actually, we're going to turn this into a stopgap AA cruiser. It's not necessarily entirely out there, but as you said, it's not actually particularly brilliant in that role either.
Yeah.
Oh well. It shall remain probably something for collectors.
Yeah, it'd be nice if it was. It's almost odd that having the Oyono available as an actual ship that actually sailed around and did stuff that they didn't choose that as the premium to go along with the line, but I guess that, like you said, they are saving that for either aviation cruiser or anti-sub cruiser. Who knows?
We shall see.
So we are done now with the Japanese destroyers. We've got a couple of other things to look at. We have the Tier 9 20s German design. Well, based on a idea from the 20s, so
yes.
how much that parlays into actually being based on any one particular thing.
Well, I mean, given in the late 1920s, we're talking about the Reichsmarine, and they are very much still sticking with the Versailles Treaty requirements, which is, that's limiting you to 11-inch guns, it's limiting you to 10,000 tons. That's why you have the Deutschlands. Yeah.
So the Admiral Schroeder, which is going to have, I think, well, nominally the same guns as 11-inch guns, 305 mils. I know that's not even 11-inch, is it?
Nope.
305, that's 10-inch. I honestly can't remember.
I think 305 is 12.
Oh, 12-inch. Okay. Yeah, no, 11 is 283, isn't it? So, 12-inch guns. So that's going to be interesting. It'll sort of have a little bit more... Well, it depends how the guns perform, I suppose, but it might potentially have a bit more punch than the... is it the Siegfried or the Aegir that has the 11-inch?
It's the same guns as like the Aegir. And the Siegfried has bigger ones.
For some reason, I always think Aegir's got 11-inch guns, but no, it's 12-inch guns on that, isn't it?
And the Siegfried has, I think, the 380, so it's the Siegfried has even better guns.
Oh. Yes.
So in some ways, this is almost like a German version of Alaska.
Maybe,
except one tier down. What's the down-tiered Alaska that we've got in game?
Congress is the tier 8 one, yeah.
So this is kind of halfway between... Because no, Alaska's tier 9, isn't it?
Yeah, tier 9.
Yeah, so this is basically German Alaska. 12-inch guns. 12-inch guns, not particularly brilliant protection.
Doesn't look like the shells are quite the same as the Aegir. That might be positing an earlier mark of ammunition or
they'd have to be if they were saying... I mean, they may be going with a similar thing to how the Deutschlands were designed, with basically a very slightly warmed over World War I era 11-inch. This may be sort of simulating a slightly warmed over World War I era 12-inch. Something that you'd more commonly find on the tier 3 and 4, probably the tier 4 battleships.
I mean, it's interesting because, it's sort of an Aegir that has the same guns but worse shells, with no torps but an engine boost.
It does have one fewer barrel, we should point out, because Aegir's got the triples 3x3 turret design. This is 2x4. Or 4x2, rather. Slightly worse range as well, but you're able to boost that, I guess. Unless am I looking at... I'm looking at Aegir with the gunfire mod system on, so I can't remember what the base range of Aegir is, but might be similar. Yeah, I'd be interested to know what the actual armor scheme is like. I think that would be... Like, the firepower is probably fine. But yeah, it sort of depends how relatively tanky it is compared to the Siegfried and the Aegir.
I mean, losing the torps is... I don't know, I would rather have the torps than an engine boost, I guess.
They can be useful at times. Definitely. Yeah. I don't know, that one looks not particularly controversial, shall we say. I mean, it's...
It looks like, to me,
but
they think Super Cruiser's sort of a tier 9 cell German one, so why not have another one?
Maybe, yeah. It does. It comes across as more of a variation of an existing thing rather than anything new or particularly interesting. So yeah, surface detectability 12.6. Actually, that's not too bad. That's actually not too bad at all. Anything else there that's particularly interesting? Not really. Yeah, that just looks like it's going to be a variation, really. And we'll see what the armor looks like, because if it's really super squishy, then that's going to be a lot less fun than if it can tank some damage on its belt.
Mm.
So I guess not too much more to say about that.
No.
And we have a super carrier for the Japanese, the Sekiryu, which it says it's a development of the Taiho class.
Well, a further development at this stage, I would say, because Hakuryu is supposedly the because there was a further development of Taiho planned in Circle 5, Circle 6, but then this is the funny thing with the Japanese is that when it comes to notionally sticking things on paper, they just put Kai insert previous ship. It's like Kai Taiho, improved Taiho. And there are a couple of instances when it comes to Circle 5 and Circle 6 where they have like Kai insert old ship here. The problem with that is that you're kind of like looking at it going, they're basically, because they're planning things quite significantly in advance, they're going, right, well, we have this design, so we want an improved version of this design for this building program, and then we're going to have an even more improved version of that for the next building program. But simultaneously, whilst you can say, yes, on paper, they wanted that concept, you flip it around, it's like, but we have absolutely no idea what that would actually have looked like. Because it's more of a statement of ambition. I mean, it's kind of like, with the modern, and if you look at the modern day with the Royal Navy saying, or the Ministry of Defence at least saying they're going to have Type 83 ships to replace the Type 45s. It's like, yeah, that's basically all we know. What that could be is anything. And with Sekiryu, I think they've just gone, okay, we've got Hakuryu, which is supposed to be a Kai Taiho, and now this is Kai Taiho. So it's got to be better than Hakuryu, and that's really about as far as it goes.
I mean, I suppose it's sort of the logical choice for, if they're going to have something that comes after the Hakuryu, then that rather than like a completely original wargaming creation, but it's almost a completely original wargaming.
See, I would have actually been more interested in seeing if they'd just gone, actually, we're going to do Shinano, but Shinano as a full-fledged fleet carrier rather than the sort of aircraft carrier support vessel that she was built at. Because that probably would have been in about the same range displacement-wise.
I heavily suspect they're saving Shinano for a tier 10 premium at some point. Or, well, semi-premium, something you'll be able to buy with real money, but also probably some in-game way as well.
Or if they ever actually make their support carrier line.
True, maybe.
Yeah, HMS Unicorn would fit in there as well. But yeah, it's just... I don't even know what to make of it, to be honest. So what was it, American Midway? Japanese Midway? Or subvariant?
We have the usual tactical squadrons, AP bombers. I don't think it's doing anything. Take a look at the stats, but I don't think any of us are particularly well qualified to talk about carriers and carrier gameplay. I certainly can't glance at the stats and go, oh yes, that's different, as in the same way I can looking at, say, battleships or cruisers. So the tactical
it's a super carrier, so it's gonna be super annoying.
Yeah, it's going to be attack aircraft and torpedo bombers. So attack squadron dive bombers. Yes.
It possibly, to a very small degree, justifies the existence of submarines.
Well, you say
considering
that, but one of the only dev blog we had in the last week that was new was that carriers are getting automatic ASW. Well, they're testing automatic ASW.
I may have been a small contributor to them wanting to do that, considering that the only times I ever take out submarines to play with, my first thing is to look at the list and go, are there carriers? Right, set course for enemy carrier, because then it's the two most unpopular ships in the game duking it out with each other, and everyone else finds it hilarious.
Cancel each other out.
Yeah.
Well, okay, we'll get everyone to direct their hate mail to you then for even more buffs. Yeah. One thing that is sort of a bit weird is that the tactical squadron torpedo bombers are 148 knots cruising speed, which is actually slower than 2/3 of the standard squadrons.
I think that's because they don't count the jet boost.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. But it's like the standard ones are 145 and the tactical squadrons are 148. But they must have a substantial boost. It doesn't actually give you the boosted speed in the stats for some reason. Don't know why. So then we have, finishing off this page, we have a Soviet super battleship, the Admiral Ushakov.
AKA Yamatosky.
Yes. So this is variant of Project 24, which, is that going to be following on from Kremlin, or is that going to be a different battleship project? I honestly can't remember.
I mean, to be honest, by this point, I mean, given how much of a paper design Kremlin was.
Yeah, Kremlin also mentions Project 24, so it's sort of, I guess, again, the same thing, but a bit more so.
It's basically somebody just went into the store and was like, give me a Kremlin, but make it super.
Yes.
Yes.
So we can at least look at the Kremlin and see how it sort of directly compares.
I think it has the exact same guns as the Kremlin. It's basically a Kremlin, I think, with more hit points and sniping special buff.
Yeah.
And this rather wonderful quad barrel 100mm mount with the 2-step guns.
Yeah, they are kind of funky looking, aren't they?
Yeah.
Let's have a look. See, so same armament as Kremlin. Does it have any special combat doodads?
Yeah, it can, like, it has that buff where it gets, I think, more range and 30% better dispersion.
Oh, yes. I think we've seen that listed previously somewhere, haven't we? So, yeah, slightly better range. I think it's got the same reload. The shells are going to be identical. I'm presuming it has a bit better AA. Probably improved a little bit. Yeah, actually, it's going to have beefier AA, 30 knots. So yeah, it's basically Kremlin +1, and the combat instructions on top of that. So Kremlin that occasionally is going to get to hit you even more accurately. So that's nice. The very last thing.
Yep.
Moving over to a different dev blog page is the announced Tier 10 Dutch destroyer, the Tromp. Now, this one has been a bit controversial in terms of its characteristics. It's kind of destroyer leader-sized, 150mm guns, and it's only going to have damage control party and an engine boost, so no smoke. And I don't think it's particularly fast either.
No, 33.5 knots.
That's going to be a bit of an odd one.
Yeah, although a historic vessel.
Okay,
Yes.
so
Trump actually existed.
well, that's always a thing in the favor of, it doesn't necessarily mean it'll be any good. But
no, but
she's existed.
She's a bit of a weird one in that kind of like the Condottieri and the very, very largest concepts for the Catributors, she's right at this boundary of light cruiser dash very large destroyer.
Mm-hmm.
She, with 5.9-inch guns, she's actually got the same kind of firepower as some of the early Italian Condottieri, the Arethusa, Agano. It's the same main battery, just on a rather smaller vessel, because basically next to no armor. On the other hand, she does have some armor, so as a destroyer, she might prove a little bit hard to crack for some of the other destroyers.
That can be a bit of a mixed blessing when it comes to destroyers, though, in terms of arming shells that otherwise might have overpenned.
Yeah, I'm thinking more about something like Haragumo or something like that. The destroyers that just tend to chuck HE at you. Having the ability to actually block some of that might be useful, but at the same time, you've got 8-second reload. You could get that down to something within the realms of high-tiered, some of the worst high-tier destroyer guns with some upgrades. But it's not a great rate of fire for 6 guns.
No, it's an 8-second reload, so you're really if you can find someone else's smoke and plink away at broadside cruisers, maybe, but you're not going to have the improved AP that the German the heavy gun destroyer line has.
No.
And they're hoping that the fact you've got an airstrike will make up for the lack of smoke and the low rate of fire, and the pretty weak torpedo load as well. It's 2 triple tubes, 13.7k damage, range 10 kilometers. Speed's not bad, reload's not bad, but those are pretty weak torpedoes at tier 10.
Yeah,
this is the controversial thing, I think, is the fact that it's going to have this airstrike.
Yeah,
it's not going to make up for the rest of it.
If I was being charitable, kind of similar to my comments actually back when you had me first on and we were talking about the Dutch cruiser line. If I was going to be particularly charitable, I might say that it might be useful for flushing out destroyers that like to camp, because you could use the airstrike on a state like we've all had. We're in a Japanese rapid firing 100mm destroyer just parks itself behind an island or in a smokescreen and just starts deluging you with lots of irritating little fire starters. If you were in a tromp, then you could just drop an airstrike on them to force them to come out, and hopefully that would do enough damage that your relatively anemic main battery firepower might be able to finish them off before they turn on you, combined with the fact you have a little bit of protection against their HE. But that seems to be a very, very specific niche counter, because it would assume that you run into an HE spamming destroyer that's gone into cover behind an island, which, okay, that's not necessarily entirely outside the realm of possibility, but it also relies on them. It relies on you being able to get to them without being, blown to pieces by everything else. And it also relies on that HE spammer ideally being, as I said, something with a 100mm gun, because if it's gearing or a daring or something like that, they'll just be like, oh, okay, that's nice, AP time.
Yeah. It's I really hope we get some movement on the core idea of this ship, but I suspect they've decided it's going to have the airstrike, and therefore it's going to be lumbered with the airstrike regardless. So you know, if you didn't have any other destroyers to worry about, I guess you could just roll around the place and sort of stealth airstrike people. But
that's assuming there's no carrier, no radar,
yeah,
no
yeah.
sub.
Unfortunately, there are such things as carriers and other destroyers, so
Yes.
you're going to have that to worry about.
And it seems that, at least reading these stats, sadly, they haven't actually included Trump's protection because she had a 38mm -1.5-inch belt of armor, as much as you can call that armor, but she had some protection, whereas the stats are giving her just 19mm plating, which makes her just as vulnerable as any other destroyer.
Yes. So we'll see. But I suspect if it comes out like not much changed from that, it's not going to be a popular choice.
I mean, they've shown with the Dutch cruisers that they do the airstrike a lot, even though nobody else does. And this looks like the same thing. They're like, well, okay, it will have bad speed, it will have no smoke, no defense mechanisms, it will have bad guns, it will have bad torps, but it has an airstrike!
It also doesn't seem to list any torpedo depth charges, so you know, that'll be fun as well, unless I'm missing something, but yeah, I don't think it does. Also, there is a poor starving cat in the background. I don't know if you can hear that.
Yeah.
I mean, no Dutch cruiser has the depth charges, so I presume they haven't given depth charges either, because that's just a thing.
He's not happy.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, poor old Trump was a bit of an awkward one, even in World War II. She's designed for the Dutch Navy, which had some very, very specific requirements in its position of, trying to maintain a colonial empire with a very, very, very minor navy that was surrounded by a lot of much, much larger navies. And yeah, I mean, she survived the war, but she got very badly beaten up in the early part of it, and then ended up basically mostly on convoy duty for the rest of it. So the fact that they're struggling to find an exact niche for her in World of Warships is probably the one of the more historically realistic elements of her.
Yeah, they were going for sort of meta realism.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully that develops into something interesting. I think that's certainly, I personally know one Dutch person that plays the game that was a bit disappointed by the Dutch cruisers, but it was at least happy to see Dutch ships in the game. So it'd be nice to see, even if they just did a conventional destroyer, I think that would make the Dutch fans happy, rather than trying to do something very gimmicky. Because the cruiser line is by definition very gimmicky.
Yes.
So who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe they'll do a conventional destroyer line at some point, but this is certainly not heralding that.
No. No, and if it was, it's like, well done, you've used up one of the very few Dutch destroyer designs.
Yes. So yeah, I think that about takes us to the end. Oh, there was one last thing we were going to sort of touch on, and that was the Sevastopol, which is the most recent Research Bureau ship to be added. And I initially, and I've sort of said this before we started, but I initially thought, oh, that's complete nonsense, completely made up. And then I'd mentioned that in a video as well, and got comments that actually it was kind of the initial idea for. I'm pretty sure it was the Kronstadt, the Kronstadt class, or whatever project number that was, to give them German 15-inch turrets, and that it was sort of part of the whole, not tech transfer exactly, but the sale of arms and tech between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union before Nazi Germany then inconveniently decided to invade. So you sort of ended up with. I think their only real sort of relic of that was the hull of the cruiser Tallinn, which I think never actually got completed. But of course, we have it in game as a completed ship. So yeah, I sort of initially looked at it and went, that's German 15-inch turrets. What are they doing on a Soviet ship? But turns out there's a little bit more historical basis to it than I thought.
Yeah, the Soviets were planning on importing they did import a lot of foreign technology for their naval vessels. I mean, you've got things like Tashkent, which is basically an Italian super destroyer with some Russian guns slapped on it, built in Italy. So it's not that they were, and as you said, you've got Tallinn, you've got they were buying all sorts of things, and there were plans to for them to buy in a whole battleship's worth or more of German 15-inch guns. Just never quite worked out, because it turns out the guns were basically effectively turned on them. Tirpitz spent a bit of time in the Baltic. But I suppose that this is your hypothetical. What if the Germans had actually delivered?
I don't know if either of you have played it, but I actually had enough research bureau points to buy it. Didn't realize it was there, because I was waiting to buy a ship. So I sort of went in, bought the Gibraltar, which is one of the other research ships, and also probably not terribly historical, but then realized, the Sevastopol is there, but it's too late. I'd already bought the Gibraltar. So I made a video on that instead.
Yeah.
I'm terribly impressed by it. But Sevastopol, I don't know. I like those German 15-inch guns on other ships. So in theory, I'd like that armament on that ship, but it sort of depends what the hull is like.
Yeah, I haven't played it myself, although you mentioned Gibraltar, I have played that. It did weirdly well in the latest Brawl series.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. I'll have to maybe dig out a video and send it to you if you're interested. But I had this very interesting match where I faced off against a Yamato in my Gibraltar, and basically almost completely demolished the Yamato from near full health, with a massive level of citadel penetrations.
I suppose that's where the quicker reload, like it's actually sub 14 seconds, and then you've got Goliath, the same guns, and it's like 18 and a half.
Just slightly fewer.
That plus the smoke.
Well, in that case, it was just coming around some islands, and that kind of brinksmanship of who's going to shoot into the other guy's bow armor first, and who's going to get the better angle. And it turned out that the Yamato fired one salvo, dummied down the other side, and had my guns lined up perfect broadside. So then once I was perfectly 90-degree broadside, just dropped the entire salvo up point blank range into the side. To be honest, I was surprised. I was just thinking, well, that might get through the armor, so I'm expecting to do a bunch of damage and then sail on past, and instead the Yamato just evaporates in a colossal fireball. I was like, that's a lot of citadels.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose if you're point blank range, pretty much. They are 9.2-inch guns. They are fairly hefty, 234 mils. So, yeah.
Oh well, such is life.
Well, yeah. Go on then. Shoot that replay over to me, and I'll.
I'll dig it out.
Yeah. So, I think that is more or less us, unless there's anything else interesting on the portal. Take a quick look at that. I don't think there is, though. I mean, there's been some miscellaneous news things like the Godzilla plus Kong clash thing is back, which I'm sure everyone's noticed if they fired up the client. They're doing another event on HMS Belfast.
Yeah.
On 11th
you coming down for that
September. One? It's the kind of thing where they'd have to cover expenses at the very least. So,
fair enough.
Yeah, I'd like to. I've never been on Belfast. I would really like to see Belfast in person. But it's always the matter of, got to pay from coming down from the Hebrides to do it.
Yeah, which is a little bit of a way.
Yes. There was also they've been transferring people from the CIS region to the EU region, which is sort of tied into wargaming, handing off various things to Leicester. So Leicester is now basically running the RU side, including RU servers and all that. And so I guess they're giving people that were playing there the option to hop onto the EU region as well, which is interesting. Presumably there will be some kind of account transferal process when the split becomes a bit more formal, and you won't be able to hop across regions on the client anymore as you can now.
Yeah.
So that kind of not like any dramatic news or anything, but it's interesting to see a little more of the shape of how things are going to be splitting post Ukraine invasion, really, and all the stuff that's led to, including this split between Leicester and Wargaming.
Yeah,
So it'll be
see how
interesting
that goes.
to get a vast influx of people from Russia, from the CIS region, or not.
Mhm.
I guess we'll see. I think there was also some reworked sounds. There's a little video on that in a news article. There's been some stuff in the UI that's
Yeah, you
changed,
have
I
more
think.
sounds when you click on buttons. And after I played the first time after this patch, it was like somebody. It felt like somebody logged in and moved every sound slide I had just slightly in a random direction. Wargaming is very good at just breaking your sound settings. Not that they changed the sliders, they just changed the internal sound values randomly in a direction, just slightly. And not for every sound category differently.
Yeah, the other thing they broke with the recent patch was for some reason the field of view. I think the field of view slider was a new thing. I think previously you could only change field of view through editing an INI file or something like that, but it
Yeah.
defaulted to a really narrow field of view for some reason. So that baffled me for about a game, and thinking, oh, why does this look really different? And then I realized, oh yeah, field of view slider, that was a thing, wasn't it? Which weirdly they haven't put in the graphics settings. They've put that in the gameplay settings because who knows. So yeah, I guess that about wraps us up. So what's the latest things on the Drac channel that we should be? I know you did an Italian submarine discussion
Yep.
with a guest that was quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. So
what else should we be looking out for?
Well, coming up later this week, we've got a very abbreviated look at Operation Neptune, the naval side of the D-Day landings.
Okay.
In between preparations for heading off to the Lincoln Steampunk Asylum this coming weekend, I'm desperately trying to finish a or at least crudely finish a large-scale model of Seydlitz, so that I can shoot it, because somebody's asked me to do a minute-by-minute chronicle of Seydlitz's journey through the Battle of Jutland, and since there's not tremendous amounts of documentary evidence for Seydlitz during the battle, just the many photos of her in almost waterlogged condition afterwards, I thought, well, what better excuse to get a 1 to 350 Seydlitz and then shoot it with BB guns to poke holes in it. I just have to establish the penetration of the standard BB versus a polyurethane shell, because I don't want to go through and through, because that would just be bad for historical accuracy. So there's those two, and then in September, I think the main highlight of what I have planned will be hopefully another video on my US trip, probably looking at USS Salem. That was the first ship we went to, and also a rather interesting discussion on why French and British ships had a distressing habit of self-detonating during the first couple of decades of the 20th century. And that's with a special guest who understands the chemistry of the explosives involved even more than myself. So that should be fair. I think I really enjoyed it. I learned a few interesting bits and pieces myself while doing the interview. So hopefully everyone else will as well.
Yeah, that does sound interesting. I have to wonder if the Halifax explosion will. I don't know if that's the right time frame actually, but if that will factor into it.
It's the right time frame, but that's not covered in our discussion, because we were looking more at the spontaneous magazine detonations and a little bit at Jutland. Whereas, to be perfectly honest, whilst the Halifax explosion is massive and powerful, and I do plan to do a video on that, the root cause of it is a somewhat more easily discerned, because someone managed to set fire to a ship full of explosives. So
I knew it was explosives. I
was just
couldn't
like,
remember offhand if it was like naval ammunition or if it was like...
It was just generalized explosives.
So, yeah.
Generalized explosives and a very, very, very stupid ship coming the other way.
Yeah.
Basically hightailing it out of Halifax Harbour on the wrong shipping lanes, and decided the best thing to do in the world would be to ram an incoming ship full of high explosives. Like, yeah well done.
Which went about as well as anyone could imagine.
Yeah. Such is life. But yeah, I do need to do it. I've got a bunch of information from my trip to Canada on that, but it's going to take a while to put it together into a single coherent video. Yes. But we shall see.
And not to bug you too much with ideas, but that Italian video also made me think there's not really a lot about Dutch subs around, especially Dutch subs in the Pacific, which
were
quite active for a while. So,
Yeah, this is one of the things...
I sprinkle an idea in your direction.
I've wanted to do that specifically, Shipper Helfricht, for quite a while. The problem is, as is the case with a lot of the smaller navies, information in the English language is scattered and sort of few and far between. Most of the literature on 1942 submarine campaigns in the Pacific are basically either stuff talking about the American campaign and desperately lamenting why they couldn't have summarily executed half of the Bureau of Ordnance, or occasional references to the British campaign, which basically amounts to, well, there wasn't much of one because we sent all our Pacific-trained T-class subs over to the Mediterranean, where it turned out massive, oceanic fleet subs did terribly in confined, shallow waters. Yeah. So there's passing references to what the Dutch were up to, but not a huge amount of detail. I suspect that there is a considerably greater amount of detail in Dutch, which is unfortunately not a language that I speak. So if any of you out there are kind of subscribed to both these wonderful people and myself, and you happen to speak Dutch, and you know of any Dutch sources on Dutch submarine operations in World War II, please get in contact, because I'd love to know more about them.
I know at least one Dutch Warships player who, I don't know how, if he reads a lot or anything, but I'll give him a poke and see if he'd be, Yeah,
I mean, that would be good, because I've recently come into possession of a ton of stuff in French, which has been very enlightening, because up until now, if you wanted to learn about French battleships, basically you bought the two John Jordan books, French Battleships World War One, and its successor that discusses the Richelieus and sub-designs. But that was basically it for decent modern sources on French battleships in extensive detail. And it turns out, well, shockingly enough, in France, there are books that size about each individual class. And I can fortunately remember just enough of my high school French to understand a decent amount of it. Although, irritatingly, the French don't seem to have a habit of actually naming the classes. There'll be the name of the ships and the title somewhere in the title, but the spine is, instead of being Richelieu class or Courbet or whatever, it's Cuirassier de 17,000 tons. It's literally just like battleships of the 17,000 or 21,000 or whatever ton class, and it's just like, okay, I understand maybe why you're doing that. However, that's very inconvenient, because now I've got to try and remember which battleship had displaced exactly what to make sure I pick up the right book. I'm thinking of just sticking post-it notes on the spine. But yeah, there's a fair bit of interesting stuff coming up, but yeah, we'll see what order it all comes out in.
Well, go subscribe to Drax's channel if you haven't already, because it's good stuff.
Thank you very much. And obviously, well, I would say subscribe to you guys, but presumably if they're watching this, they already are. If for some reason you aren't, go do that. Right.
Yeah, it's been great having you again. And I'm sure we will get you back when the next ship lines emerge.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have any other reference books that are quite that weighty, so my knees will forgive me.
You need to find a different book then to train your strength.
Yeah. Oh well.
Either that or get one copy so you've got one for each hand so you can get your balanced weightlifting going.
Yeah.
And with that useful life advice, we all wish you good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.